The Tonight Show was supposed to open with laughter and music, but Johnny Carson did something unprecedented. He stopped everything, silenced the band, and asked 20 million viewers to join him in honoring a crew member's unspeakable loss. What happened next changed television. February 11th, 1979. It was a Monday evening, and The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson was preparing for its nightly broadcast. The studio audience was seated and buzzing with excitement. Doc Severinsen and his band were in position, ready to play the iconic Tonight Show theme. Ed McMahon was reviewing his notes for the opening. Everything was running exactly as it should. But backstage, something was happening that would change the course of that night's show in ways no one could have anticipated. James Patterson, a longtime camera operator who had been with The Tonight Show since 1965, had arrived at work that afternoon despite having received the worst news any parent can receive. That morning, his 6-year-old son Michael had been killed in a car accident on his way to school. A drunk driver had run a red light, and Michael's life had ended instantly. James had called the studio to say he wouldn't be able to work, but his supervisor had misunderstood and thought James was simply running late. When James arrived at NBC, not to work but to collect his personal belongings because he couldn't imagine being there, word of what had happened spread through the crew with devastating speed. Johnny Carson was in his dressing room, going over his monologue notes, when Fred DeCordova knocked on the door. Fred's face was pale, and Johnny immediately knew something was wrong. "Johnny, we have a situation," Fred said quietly. "James Patterson's son was killed this morning. Car accident. The boy was only 6 years old." Johnny felt as if he'd been physically struck. He knew James well, had worked with him for nearly 15 years. He knew James's wife Margaret, had seen photos of little Michael, had heard James talk proudly about his son learning to read. "Where's James now?" Johnny asked. "He's in the equipment room packing his things," Fred replied. "He said he just needed to get his stuff and he'd be gone." He apologized for the inconvenience. Johnny stood up, his monologue notes forgotten. He apologized? His son just died and he's apologizing to us? He's in shock, Johnny. We all are. Johnny was quiet for a moment, then said something that would lead to one of the most memorable moments in television history. "We're not doing the show as planned tonight." Fred DeCordova looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Johnny, we have a full studio audience, guests waiting, sponsors expecting." "I don't care," Johnny interrupted, his voice firm but emotional. "One of our family just lost his child. We're not going to pretend that didn't happen. We're not going to tell jokes and act like everything is normal when it's not." "What do you want to do?" Fred asked. "I want to honor Michael," Johnny said. "And I want James to know that he's not alone, that we're here for him, and that his son mattered." Within minutes, Johnny had gathered the entire crew, cameramen, sound technicians, lighting crew, production assistants, makeup artists, everyone who made The Tonight Show possible. He told them what he planned to do and asked if anyone objected. No one did. When The Tonight Show began that night, something was different from the start. The usual energetic opening music didn't play. Doc Severinsen's band sat in silence. Ed McMahon didn't give his booming introduction. Instead, the curtain opened to reveal Johnny Carson standing alone on the stage, looking more serious than viewers had ever seen him. The studio audience, expecting the usual fun and laughter, immediately sensed that something was wrong. The excited chatter died down to confused murmurs, then to complete silence. Johnny walked to the center of the stage and looked directly at the camera. "Good evening," he said, his voice quiet and somber. "Before we begin tonight's show, I need to tell you something. And I need to ask something of you." The studio audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "This morning, a 6-year-old boy named Michael Patterson was killed in a car accident on his way to school. Michael was the son of James Patterson, who has been a camera operator on this show for nearly 15 years. James is not just a member of our crew. He's part of our family. And today, our family is heartbroken." Johnny paused, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. Now, James tried to come in today to collect his things. He didn't want to inconvenience anyone. He didn't want to disrupt the show. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man James Patterson is. But tonight we're going to disrupt the show, Johnny continued, because some things are more important than entertainment. Some losses are too profound to ignore, and some people deserve to be honored. Johnny turned to address not just the studio audience, but the millions watching at home. I'm asking you, all of you, to join me in something we've never done on this show before. I'm asking you to sit with me in silence for 3 minutes to honor the memory of Michael Patterson, and to let James know that his son mattered, that his grief matters, and that he's not alone. The request hung in the air. This was unprecedented. Television shows didn't do this. Viewers tuned in for entertainment, not for silence and grief. But Johnny Carson understood something fundamental about human connection. That sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone in pain is simply acknowledge their loss and stand with them in it. James, Johnny said, looking directly at one of the cameras, if you're watching this from home, or if you're somewhere here in the building, I want you to know that we love you, and we're so sorry for your loss. Michael was here with us once, when you brought him to work. He was a beautiful, bright little boy, and the world is less without him in it. Then Johnny did something that no talk show host had ever done. He simply stood there, center stage, and said nothing. The studio audience sat in complete silence, understanding the gravity of the moment. Doc Severinsen and his band members sat motionless at their instruments. Ed McMahon stood off to the side, tears streaming down his face. The cameras stayed on Johnny, who stood with his head slightly bowed, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes closed. For 3 full minutes, The Tonight Show, America's premier entertainment program, became a memorial service for a 6-year-old boy that most viewers had never heard of until that moment. It was the most powerful silence in television history. When the 3 minutes ended, Johnny looked up and spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for honoring Michael, and thank you for standing with James in his grief." Then something remarkable happened. The studio audience began to applaud. Not the usual enthusiastic Tonight Show applause, but something different. It was respectful, emotional, and deeply heartfelt. It was the sound of 300 people acknowledging that they had just participated in something sacred. Johnny raised his hand to quiet the applause. "We're going to continue with tonight's show now, because that's what we do. But I want you to remember that behind every television show, every movie, every piece of entertainment you enjoy, there are dozens of people you never see who make it possible. People like James Patterson. People who show up to work even when life is hard, who do their jobs with pride and professionalism, and who deserve our recognition and respect. James, we're dedicating tonight's show to Michael. And we're here for you, whatever you need, for as long as you need it." The Tonight Show that aired after those 3 minutes of silence was different from any other episode. Johnny's jokes were gentle rather than sharp. His interviews with guests were more thoughtful, more focused on human connection than on getting laughs. The guests themselves, informed of what had happened, approached their appearances with unusual seriousness and grace. It was still The Tonight Show, still entertaining, but it was tempered by the acknowledgement that real life, with all its pain and loss, existed beyond the bright lights and laughter. The response to Johnny's tribute was overwhelming. The NBC switchboard received over 15,000 calls in the hours following the broadcast. But unlike typical viewer responses about comedy bits or celebrity interviews, these calls were different. People called to thank Johnny for acknowledging grief on television. Parents who had lost children called to say they felt seen and heard. Television critics, initially skeptical of using entertainment airtime for such a somber moment, found themselves deeply moved and praising Johnny's humanity. One letter to NBC, which Johnny later framed in his office, read, "In a world that tells us to hide our grief and put on a happy face, You showed us that it's okay to stop everything and acknowledge loss. You reminded us that people matter more than programming. Thank you, James Patterson. Didn't return to work for 3 months. During that time, Johnny Carson and the entire Tonight Show staff supported him in ways big and small. Johnny personally called James every week. The crew organized meal deliveries to James's home. The show's staff attended Michael's funeral, filling an entire section of the church. When James finally returned to work in May 1979, Johnny stopped the pre-show meeting to welcome him back. The entire crew gave him a standing ovation, not for returning to work, but for his courage in continuing to live after such an unimaginable loss. "I watched that broadcast," James told Johnny privately. "I saw what you did, and I want you to know that those 3 minutes meant more to Margaret and me than I can possibly express. You didn't have to do that. You could have just sent flowers or called, but you stopped your show that millions of people watch, to honor our son. That's something I'll never forget." Johnny Carson's decision to honor Michael Patterson had ripple effects throughout the television industry. Other shows began to acknowledge that the people behind the cameras had lives, families, and struggles that deserved recognition. The concept of supporting employees through grief became more formalized across the industry. NBC instituted new policies for bereavement support. Other networks followed suit. The idea that workplace family meant actually caring for people during their hardest times became more than just a corporate platitude. Mental health professionals who studied grief and loss began using footage of those 3 minutes of silence as an example of how communities can honor loss collectively. The simple act of stopping everything to acknowledge someone's pain became recognized as a powerful form of support. For the rest of his career, Johnny Carson never spoke publicly about that night in detail. When asked about it in interviews, he would simply say, "James Patterson is a good man who suffered a terrible loss, and we did what anyone would do. We were there for him." But to those who worked with Johnny, that night represented everything about who he really was. Not Johnny Carson the entertainer, or Johnny Carson the celebrity, but Johnny Carson the human being who understood that people mattered more than ratings, that compassion was more important than comedy, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply stop and acknowledge someone's pain. James Patterson continued to work as a camera operator on The Tonight Show until Johnny's final episode in 1992. On Johnny's last night, when the credits rolled and the crew was acknowledged, James Patterson was standing in the wings with tears in his eyes, holding a photograph of his son Michael. Today, when television historians discuss the most important moments in broadcasting history, those 3 minutes of silence are always mentioned. Not because they were entertaining, but because they were real. They represented a moment when television stopped being about ratings and advertising and became about something more fundamental: the acknowledgement of human loss and the power of collective compassion. Johnny Carson stopped The Tonight Show that night, not because something went wrong with the production, but because something had gone devastatingly wrong in the life of someone he cared about. And in stopping, in choosing silence over entertainment, grief over laughter, humanity over programming, he created one of the most profound moments in television history. Those 3 minutes taught America that it's okay to pause, to acknowledge loss, to sit with grief instead of rushing past it. They showed that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is stop everything and say, "This person matters. This loss matters, and we're going to honor it together." If this incredible story of leadership and compassion moved you, make sure to subscribe for more true stories about the moments when television showed us the best of humanity. Share this video with someone who works behind the scenes making things possible, and let them know their work matters and their lives matter. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stop and acknowledge that someone is in pain, and let them know they're not alone. This has been the final video in our Johnny Carson series. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the moments when America's favorite entertainer showed us that true greatness isn't measured by laughs or ratings, but by how we treat people when it matters most.